one time started a cross-examination of a scientist who was an expert witness, told him I was a scientist myself, having majored in political science. So I'm afraid that I'm not going to be much help on the technical end. So I think the best thing to do is, if we can, is to start with the slides. I have found that the images themselves interest people, and they kind of have a life of their own as we
proceed. Yeah, and to let everyone know tonight, I'm going to be Mr. Conroy's techie. So he sent me his PowerPoint. So when he says next slide, I'm the guy saying next slide. So if something goes wrong with the next slide, it ain't him, it's me. So just let you know that I'm letting you behind the curtain.
Thank you, Mark. Can we start then with the first slide? You have an issue? Ah. There we go. Okay, is everybody in? All right. I'm often asked at book talks how I decided to write a book about any particular topic. And in this case, there are really two reasons why I decided to write a book about Jefferson's White House. One is that I had just finished a book on Lincoln's White House, and that one followed another book about the Hampton Roads Peace Conference, which had not been the subject of a book before, where Lincoln met with senior members of the Confederate government toward the end of the war to try to negotiate a peaceful end to the war. And then, having turned to the Lincoln White House, I was not smart enough to come up with a third new idea, so I thought that Jefferson's White House might be interesting for a couple of reasons. First, I spent 9 years in Washington on congressional staff, and used to think a lot about what the place must have been like in 1800, when it was built in really what amounted to a literal swamp. And it always struck me as sort of odd and eccentric that the capital of the United States was in such a backwater. And I always thought it might be interesting to dig in and see what that was like. And the second reason was that as I did start to research the subject to decide whether to write about it, it became clear to me that Jefferson had used the White House in four particular ways that I found interesting and in some ways relevant to our own situation today. The first two were political, and we'll talk about this as we go, but the first two uses he made of the White House were political. One was, believe it or not, to try to heal a divided country. As we'll discuss, the United States polity in 1801 was almost as divided and hostile internally as we are today. And Jefferson committed himself to try to heal the country and use the White House for that purpose, as we'll discuss. The second is that in the Washington and Adams administrations that preceded his, there had grown up around the presidency a kind of a whiff of monarchy, is the way that Jefferson described it, which, as he said, was natural enough since people had grown up with a monarchy and really didn't have another model for how a chief executive should be treated. But Jefferson thought it was highly dangerous, and as we'll discuss, took steps to use the White House to blow that away. The third way he made use of it was to promote the West, which we'll talk about in a moment, which was brand new to the country, pretty much as if astronauts had come back from the moon. And he used the White House to promote interest in the West. And the last use he made of it was to convert it into a kind of an Enlightenment salon, which was a completely new idea in this country, and perhaps in its way the most entertaining and interesting of the four. So if you can go ahead, Mark, with the next slide, please. So we're all pretty familiar with this marble god built in the middle of World War II in Washington at the Jefferson Memorial. Beautiful building, beautiful statue, sort of, you know, materializes this marble image that when I was growing up, Jefferson and his peers had in this country. Everybody knows, I guess, that he's the primary author of the Declaration of Independence. A little less well known, perhaps, that his main role in founding the country and the system was to make sure that the common man, the small farmer, the small business person, the sort of backbone of the country as he saw it, not the working class, because there really wasn't much of a working class in those days, but the kind of lower middle class of craftsmen and farmers and small business owners. And all of that goes into his White House as well. Next, please. Personally, though, I prefer this freelance sketch of Jefferson that was done in a matter of half an hour or so at the White House in 1804 when he was president by his principal architect, who we'll talk about as well, Benjamin Latrobe, who, as you can see, is also a talented portrait artist. And I think what appeals to me about this picture is that it projects a great deal more of Jefferson's personality and character than that marble god does. There's a kind of a wit there, there's an intelligence, a sort of charm that everybody who encountered Jefferson, friend and foe alike, often spoke of. Some of you may recall or have read that when John F. Kennedy was in the White House and invited to a dinner there all of the Nobel Prize winners in the entire Western world, all of whom I'm sure came who could get there. And he started out the presentation by saying that this was surely the greatest assembly of knowledge and human talent that had ever been collected in the White House, with the possible exception of when Jefferson dined alone. The brilliance of Jefferson is legendary. The book gets into it in some depth, and we don't have time to go into it in that kind of detail. But apart from his political expertise and his sort of fame in his own time as what was called the pen of the revolution, he was one of the leading scientists of the Western world at the time. At a point in time when just about all of human knowledge could be contained in a large set of books, Jefferson had read all of those books and had corresponded with many of the leading figures of the age, both abroad and at home, and all kinds of inventions and innovations. He invented the metric system. He was a pioneer in archaeology and botany and immunology. You wouldn't believe the depth of intelligence and achievement, even apart from his political career. The elephant in the room, of course, is the slavery issue, which has always been an issue with Jefferson, probably never more so than what we have today, and all of the sensitivity that has been brought to all of our minds by these demonstrations. And we'll talk about that as we go as well. Next, please. So the first thing to keep in mind about Washington, D.C. in 1801, when this painting was completed, is the incredibly bucolic nature of Washington in those days. This painting was done from a hill in Georgetown. Those of you who are familiar with Washington will know that there are hilly sections of Georgetown. This was done from one of those hills. The Potomac River is dead ahead of you. In the middle of the river is what was called Mason's Island. Today it's Roosevelt's Island. Key Bridge runs right near that island. And if you look down to the left, sort of middle part of the foreground, you will see a few suggestions of white buildings. That's Washington, D.C. you would barely have taken it in from that position in 1801 when Jefferson took office. Next, please. This sketch was done by Jefferson in the 1790s of his vision of what Washington would be and would become. Again, you see the Potomac River off to the left and Mason's Island in the middle of the river. This view is from roughly where the Washington Monument would be today, looking up toward the north. And what's interesting to me is that you see off to the right there, he's got the Capitol written in, it's almost the back of a napkin kind of diagram. And then the president's house to the left of that with a walking mall in between and this kind of small town that he envisioned growing up around the White House and the Capitol. And in fact, as we know, the city was laid out just as Jefferson sketched it in this very rough diagram, although on a much bigger scale. Next, please. This is an Andrew Wyeth painting from the 1930s in kind of that WPA post office style, showing Washington and Jefferson overseeing the construction of the White House. Jefferson was Secretary of State under Washington and was given responsibility for overseeing the building of Washington and also of the president's house. Next, please. This is a contemporary modern painting of what that work looked like as it progressed. And you can see not only the construction, but if you look past it and around the rural countryside that the president's house was built in. Next, please. This is a contemporary engraving, hand-colored at the time of the Senate wing of the United States Capitol. And if you've been there and seen it on TV, certainly, whatever, most of us have been there, you can say that that is essentially what you would see today if you were looking at the Senate wing of the Capitol. If you look to the right, you see that little cluster of buildings way down the hill there, which again gives you some sense of scale of what Washington was like in those days. And if you look to the left, you can see that the Senate wing ends abruptly. There is just open sky to the left because that's all there was at the time, was the Senate wing. Next, please. This drawing was done by the architect of the Capitol's office to show what Capitol Hill looked like in Jefferson's day in the first term. Again, you've got the Senate wing on the right. You've got on the left a temporary structure that was built for the House. It was called the oven at the time, not only for its shape, of a kind of a beehive oven of that day, but also for its temperature. It supposedly was not a very pleasant place to be, particularly when people started realizing that it was about to come down on their heads because the foundation had not been done properly. So you see these timbers that were leaned against the oven to keep it from falling down on the House of Representatives. And then in between, you've got this kind of covered wooden walkway between the two buildings. That's what you would have seen if you were standing by where the Supreme Court is today and looking back down toward the city. Next, please. So this is a modern map done by a very talented cartographer by the name of Don Hawkins, who has reconstructed what the city of Washington would have mapped out to in 1801 when Jefferson took office. I think it's very interesting for a number of reasons. One, again, to give you a perspective, to the left is Georgetown, the upper left corner there. Below that, Mason's Island, the wide Potomac River, about twice as wide as it is today before it was filled in at all. But if you look almost to the middle and up a bit, you'll see the president's house labeled as such with the great, lawn area in front of it. There's what I would call a village that's begun to spread out from the White House, both east and west. Kind of little brick homes, little brick shops, white picket fences. It's kind of a picture book village. To the north, there is very, very little. What you can see there is trees where streets would one day be, where blocks would one day be. So if you see the outline of trees in blocks, there are no blocks, there are no streets. That's all just wooded land. And then the Capitol is at the far right in the middle of the screen. It's said at the time that that stretch of land between the Capitol and the White House, which was called the President's House at the time, was as wild as Kentucky, except the soil was no good, as one British diplomat described it. And then down below, you've really got nothing at all. There's the river, there's this vast malarial marsh on the right that runs all the way from that little inlet of the river all the way down, and essentially undeveloped, open, full of mosquitoes, and not a healthy place to be. Next, please. This is one of my favorites as well. This was done by something called the Historical Imaging Project at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, under the aegis of a fellow named Don Bailey, who gave us leave to use it. It's a very carefully reconstructed projection of what the Capitol looked like when the British burned it, which is 1814, 5 years after Jefferson left the presidency. But again, it gives you this sense of incredibly vast, open countryside that our Capitol consisted of, even after the House wing had been built there on the left after Jefferson's time and before the British burned everything down. Next, please. Now I show you this, this old engraving of a coach bogged down in a stream as a kind of a discussion point for the isolation of Washington, D.C. in those days. The only way to get there was by coach or elaborate series of water transportation. Typically to get from the city of Baltimore to the city of Washington, which was a coach ride through a pristine forest on a dirt path, would take you 10 hours. Baltimore being the nearest real city. To come from Boston to Washington was about 10 days. Stopping at god-awful inns with indescribable food, sleeping in the same bed with a new acquaintance, riding knee to knee and, you know, shoulder to shoulder with 6 other people for 10 days to get there from Boston. So you didn't go unless you had to, is the short description. Next, please. This is one of the key characters in the book. The the secretary, I should say, to the British ambassador to the United States at the time, Augustus John Foster, young Oxford graduate, very sophisticated, son of a, let's say, a close friend of the Duke of Devonshire, who his mother lived with the Duke of Devonshire and his wife in an open arrangement that in that day nobody much cared about at the higher levels of society. But Augustus John Foster is a very witty, clever guy whose observations about the city and Jefferson and the House at the time are throughout the book, largely, I think, because foreigners bring fresh eyes. You know, when you see a British sophisticate describing what he encounters, you're getting it as you and I might have gotten it, dropping into that situation from cosmopolitan London, having been educated in Oxford and in Paris and in Berlin. It's an interesting source of commentary. Next, please. So this is an almost contemporary watercolor of the President's House done by this architect, Benjamin Latrobe. The only known contemporary rendering of the President's House at that time. Again, you see the openness of the countryside. There's a stone wall around it, which Jefferson caused to be built during all of his administration. Lasted about 80 years, was called Jefferson's Wall during that period of time. And if you look straight at the house, At first, it seems like what we would see today, but there's no portico. Those columns in the front there are engaged columns, I think is the correct architectural term. They're basically pilasters, if that's pronounced properly. As you can see, I'm no architect, but there was no portico. Jefferson and Latrobe designed the portico, not only to provide shelter for people coming and going, but also to give the house a kind of a presence and a kind of an iconic look that, of course, it has today. Next, please. This is Benjamin Latrobe, the architect, British-born, mixed American and British parentage, educated as an architect in London, and came to the United States in the late 1790s looking for work. There was a great demand for architects at the time. He was certainly one of the major architects in America. The only other name architect in America was Bulfinch in Boston. And apart from those two, there really was not much to speak of by way of architectural talent, except for Jefferson himself, who was a completely self-taught sophisticate in architectural design, in building construction, the mechanics, the nuts and bolts, as well as the decor and the designing of it. And the two of them collaborated together, sometimes with less than gentle elements and moments, as I think almost every pair of great artists does when they collaborate. You get a kind of a Lennon-McCartney tension, as well as the, you know, the product that comes from that. Next, please. This is a modern drawing done by a friend I made who's an architectural historian, illustrating the book in various places. This is the view of the White House that you would have seen looking at it from the northwest. So that if you picture the portico that's not there, there's instead a wooden ramp going up to the front door. Around the house was dug what was called an areaway that would allow light and air to get into the basement and allow tradesmen to come and go without being seen. That areaway is still there. We don't see it, but it's still submerged below ground. And that rickety wooden ramp was what you would have gone up if you went to see the White House in that day with no protection from the weather at all. In front of it also, in that kind of domed low building there, is the ice house and wine cellar that Jefferson caused to be built as the very first thing he did when he took office mechanically, taking care of that wine collection, which we will get into. Next, please. This is Latrobe's architectural rendering of what he and Jefferson designed. So it's a future projection of what the building will look like, and in fact does look like now. This is looking at it from the other side that we just looked at it, from the Capitol Hill side. And if you look on the right, you've got the portico now that we have today. And on the left, you have the south portico that also did not exist in Jefferson's day and was designed by Latrobe and Jefferson and later put in place after the building was restored in the wake of the British firing of it. Next, please. And now we have two quick more line drawings here. One is looking at the building straight on from Pennsylvania Avenue. Jefferson and Latrobe also designed and installed these long one-story abutments on both sides of the house, which instead of outbuildings like stables and barns and privies and you know, forage sheds and things of that kind, all of that would be done in the booths or bays along this low one-story projection on both ends, servants' quarters, kitchen, ice, you know, everything you can imagine. But from the outside, you see this lovely kind of classical Palladian design hiding all of that from the public. That's all still there today as well. Next, please. And then if you look at it from the other side, downhill from the White House, like very small columns from the north, opens up with these bays as seen from the south. So you got these Tuscan pillars along those bays to the right, which the servants and the staff and so forth could walk through without anybody seeing them from the north. Next. So this also is a contemporary modern painting, but very meticulously researched, of Jefferson's office in the president's house at the time. You have these enormous double height ceilings, if not more than double height. This now is the dining room, by the way, in today's White House, or I should say the one section of the dining room. It's now expanded. Jefferson's office at the time, terrific collections of scientific instruments, books, maps, charts, all sorts of technological innovations, a caged mockingbird. You can see the cage on the left, and you can see the liberated mockingbird in the upper right, because Jefferson would open the door and let the mockingbird fly around. It would land on his shoulder, it would sing to him, and follow him upstairs when he was done for the day. Next, please. Now this is, I think, interesting from a human interest point of view. It's a portrait of Maria Cosway, which Jefferson had in his office and kept in his personal space for the rest of his life. He was widowed, Jefferson wasn't, at the age of 36, I think he was. His wife died at 28 or 9 after childbirth. And family lore has it that she asked him to promise her on his deathbed that he would never remarry. And in fact, he did not remarry. Had several daughters, other children who died in childhood, but never married. Maria Cosway is a young woman he met in Paris while he was doing diplomatic duty there. And they clearly developed a relationship. Nobody really knows the extent of that relationship. But the difficulty was that Maria Cosway was married to Richard Cosway, a British artist. And there's correspondence between them that's very sort of suggestive and enticing, but no one knows for sure what that relationship was, except by the evidence of Jefferson having that picture in his office the rest of his life. Next, please. This, by the way, is a self-portrait by Maria Cosway, who was a very talented artist herself and quite a figure in Paris in the time of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Next, please. So then we come to the problem of the piece. This is regrettably a slave pen, as it was called, that was located roughly at the foot of Capitol Hill, where slaves were kept and traded and auctioned and paraded around the streets in chains. We don't have time to get in much to this issue, and it's certainly not the focus of the book, but it's a underlying current in the book. I would only point out to you that Jefferson is well aware at the time of the hypocrisy of being the author of equal rights for all men created equal, sitting on top of this system. Many arguments can be made back and forth about what his views were in his time and place, but it's clear that enlightened people, even then, were well aware that slavery was a moral and political abomination, a hideous blot on society, and I forget the third, let me see, I have it here, a moral and political depravity, an abominable crime, and a hideous blot on American society. And we know that that was the enlightened view because Jefferson wrote all three of those descriptions of slavery to friends and said in public, wrote in public, I should say, in the only book he ever wrote, that I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. So again, without taking the time to get into the details, we'll go through some of this as we finish through these slides, as far as how it worked through the staff at the White House. Next, please. This is an actual photograph of one of Jefferson's slaves that was taken after Jefferson's death. But when this man, I think of his first name now, I'm blocking it. Granger was his last name. Great George Granger, sorry, was a blacksmith and also the only black man who ever was an overseer of Jefferson's plantation. One of his nieces became a cook in the White House and later at Monticello as well. And we'll talk about that. Next, please. This is an earlier painting of Jefferson that was done when he was Secretary of State. One of the real Jefferson scholars, great Jefferson scholars in the country by the name of Peter Onuf, was kind enough to spend some time with me as I worked through some of this material in the book. And Peter Onuf, who won the Pulitzer Prize writing a biography of Jefferson, refers to this slavery issue as Jefferson therapy, that just when you think you've got this incredibly enlightened, progressive, way ahead of his time guy, doing all he can for the common man against monarchs and dukes and such, you read some letter that he writes, and he expresses an 18th century view that curls your hair a bit and you take some wind out of your sails, and then you turn to another letter and you see again the genius. Jefferson therapy can be a weary experience that the book goes into more than I can here. Next, please. This is a Monticello rendering of the kitchen there, which would have been very much like the kitchen in the White House in one of those bays that I pointed out to you. There were 3 black young women who had been enslaved at Monticello, who Jefferson brought up in succession to the White House to learn French cuisine from the French chef who he hired to prepare meals at the White House, which they did. They stayed there for the full 8 years, learned French cuisine, were treated, by the way, in a kind of a gray zone between slavery and free labor. They stayed in the same quarters as everybody else, reported to the same supervisors, had free time, a little spending money, could go out and socialize in the city, which they did, and then came back and learned this craft. And then after Jefferson went back to Monticello, he brought them back with them, and for the rest of his life, they were the head cooks at Monticello. Next, please. Just a quick touch on the political scene at the time. This is an anti-Jefferson political cartoon from his re-election campaign. We don't have time to go into the details, but suffice it to say that what we have is the American eagle, inspired by God, up in the right-hand corner, snatching the Constitution from Jefferson's hand before he has time to throw it in the fire on the altar of Gallic despotism, which refers to the French Revolution and the idea of the power residing in the people, and all of that, that point of view that Jefferson's opponents in the Federalist Party despised him for. He actually, I should say, FDR echoed him. FDR said something very similar in his own day, but Jefferson said that if the Federalists, who were essentially the party of the rich and the wealthy and the conservatives, that if they ever stopped hating me, I would start to feel suspicious about myself. So you've got this incredible friction and tension and animosity between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans about all the same kind of issues we have today at a level of vituperation that rivals our own. Next, please. So Jefferson decides that having been elected president, he is going to make it one of his primary goals to, as he writes to a daughter, see that form of government firmly established to which I have devoted my entire life. You got to remember that this is only 12 years in, and he has already to the American system of government. It's new. There are no deep traditions. Washington and Adams had made a very kind of monarchical flavor to it all. And Jefferson was determined to see that set aside. Next, please. Adams here was, of course, had been president, that Jefferson had unseated him from the White House. They had been very close friends, diplomats together in France and England, and became somewhat estranged because of the very nasty campaign that was run on both sides, but never quite lost that tie and corresponded with each other the rest of their lives. Next, please. Alexander Hamilton. I find it extremely ironic that Alexander Hamilton is now a rap star, given that if there were a right-wing figurehead for everything that we now see, or almost everything we now see on the right wing of the political spectrum, it would be embodied in Alexander Hamilton. As everybody, or almost everybody certainly knows, Jefferson's great rival, and indeed the leader of what was called the High Federalists, not merely Federalists, but really intense arch-conservative Federalists, and sort of the antithesis to Jefferson's view of the world. Next, please. Timothy Pickering, a senator from Massachusetts. I actually gave this talk on Halloween one time, and it occurred to me you could not have a better face for Halloween than Timothy Pickering. Very sour, very hateful toward anything having to do with democracy of the common man. And once wrote a friend, having been told that Jefferson was suffering from an impacted tooth and suffering great pain, he said that he hoped he would continue to do so, and that when it became unbearable, that he would go get a rope and hang himself like Judas. That would be the fitting end for the worst president that a country ever had, the worst leader that a country ever had. So we're talking the same kind of vituperation that we have today. Next, please. Aaron Burr is Jefferson's vice president, his fellow Democratic Republican. Again, we don't have time for Burr, a figure that would have made headlines in the tabloids today had they been around in those days. Next, please. And then John Marshall, who's a great figure at the time and still today, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Adams, by the way, appointed him Chief Justice about a week before he left office, and the outgoing Senate confirmed him on their way out the door with the Jeffersonians coming in. So you think Mitch McConnell pulled one, John Adams pulled a bigger one with John Marshall. Next, please. So now we can talk a bit about the difference between the Washington and Jefferson regimes. We got a little bit of a late start. I'm running a little later than I thought I would be, but if everybody's cool with it, I will keep going past 8 slightly, and we'll try to speed it up. Jefferson has this official portrait done by Gilbert Stuart, which most of us are familiar with. But you got to look at the details of this and what it's telling us. You've got this gilded furniture with a kind of Roman imperial style, red velvet draperies and cloth on the table. Washington is dressed in this portrait as if the equivalent of, say, white tie and tails in our time. Very, very formal, very stiff, in a kind of a regal setting and a regal posture, with a sword on his hip, which is a kind of a symbol of aristocracy. Next, please. Jefferson's official portrait, you can see the stark contrast. This is one of his official portraits. No background at all, very austere, kind of brown, barely highlighting his face, plain black suit. He only had one, and that English diplomat, Augustus John Foster, describes it as his gala dress. He dressed abysmally, frayed collars, kind of soiled stockings, looked like a country farmer, maybe in his pew in church, if you were lucky. Completely different imagery projecting there than what Washington had projected. Next, please. Washington, when he was president, had weekly levees, as they were called, which are great open gatherings for the public, theoretically open to anyone. In fact, really only attended by the wealthy and elite of the city. This is one of those levees rendered by an artist back when the Capitol was in New York. Mrs. Washington standing there, Lady Washington is what she was called under the Washington administration, on a raised platform. And these other ladies would come up and curtsy deeply to Lady Washington, very much in imitation of George III. Next, please. You've got now Washington's inauguration, where he's going in this coach and four with 4 white horses, liveried coach driver, postilions riding his outriders in uniform behind him, again, very much like the king. Jefferson refused to ride in any carriage, anytime, would always either walk or ride his own horse, unescorted, unaccompanied, and right out among the public like anybody else. Next, please. So this gives you a sense of Monticello's dining room, very much like it would have been in the White House, which of course was burned by the Brits, and we don't have it, the interior. But we do have reason to be sure that it was very much like this. And Jefferson made that dinner table the focal point of the White House as part of this healing enterprise that we talked about. Rather than having these weekly levees, which he eliminated immediately, his door was open anytime to anyone. So the most common man or woman in the city of Washington, such as it was, could go up, knock on the door, be admitted, asked to see the president, be escorted to a little waiting room, and he would come out in 5 minutes and chat with you for 10 minutes or so about whatever you wanted to talk about. At these dinners, he would invite every night, well, not every night, I should say 3 or 4 nights a week, 14 to 16 members of Congress who would come around and eat this wonderful food prepared by his French chef, drink wonderful wines in great quantity from all over the world. I don't mean to suggest drunkenness, because there was not that, but they were premium cuisine in a beautiful home in that sort of wilderness capital that was a refuge for anybody who wanted a good night out. And Jefferson used that opportunity, inviting members of Congress. He said there were only 3 rules in the House: no toasts, no politics, and no restraint. You couldn't give toasts because people would fall over drunk after the 8th toast, and you couldn't talk politics because you wanted everybody to defuse, disarm, and get to know each other as fellow human beings. And then no restraint. Let's just talk about whatever comes to mind, whatever we want to do to get to know each other and become friends and not enemies. Next, please. This is just a quick take on one of his innovations, a rotating dumbwaiter built into the wall at Monticello, and there were 2 of these in Washington as well. And the staff would put the food in the shelving there and then spin the dumbwaiter into the room, so that no waiters, you would just take the food off the shelves, family style. Everybody kind of serve themselves, serve each other. And the absence of servants meant that everybody could speak freely, because otherwise whatever you said would be on the street before you were. And Jefferson devised this mechanical device to make that possible. Next, please. I came across this on the internet and couldn't resist, because not only did Jefferson bring all kinds of delicacies from Europe to America that had never been seen here before, but one of those he describes as potatoes cut into thin strips, deep fried and served with salt and sauces. So definitely the inventor of the French fry. Next, please. Getting now to this idea of the salon, the kind of people that Jefferson had there to promote American philosophy and art and literature. This is Charles Wilson Peale. who was one of the great minds of his time, and had also opened the first museum in the United States in Philadelphia. And this is his own painting, he's also a great artist, of him opening the curtain to that museum. And on the right there on the ground, you see mammoth bones, which were also on display there. And he and Jefferson loved all of this stuff and would correspond and rhapsodize about archaeology and paleontology and ethnology and all of this at the White House when Peale came for dinner as a visitor, which he often did. Next, please. This is a self-portrait by Peale. So that's who you'd have seen sitting across from you at Jefferson's table after 2 or 3 glasses of wine on a nice night. Next, please. Many people have heard about this duplicating device that Jefferson did not invent, but he did perfect, working with Peale. In the days before photocopiers, of course, you would write a letter with the pen and paper on the left side of this device, and then on the right side, the pen and paper would follow you along and copy your letter simultaneously as you wrote it. I can't tell you how many hours Jefferson spent perfecting every nut and bolt and screw in that device, had many of them made, portables, laptops, desktops, which he brought with him whenever he traveled, gave away as gifts, and generally loved to work with there in the White House. Next, please. Some of the people who passed through this salon, if you would want to call it, Thomas Paine, who was considered the devil himself by the Federalist Party. Maybe remember from school days reading The Rights of Man and Common Sense and all these radical thoughts about democracy and leveling and such. Jefferson loved the guy and would have him stay at the White House when he came, which was a kind of a scandal among the Federalists, who could not believe that he would expose his children and his grandchildren to the devil himself. Next, please. John Quincy Adams, as a young man, was a senator from Massachusetts, the son of John Adams, a Federalist as his father, but had bonded as a teenager with Jefferson in France when they lived there together, and kind of idolized Jefferson, looked up to him, said he loved to be with him, loved to have dinner with him. And they had a personal bond, almost a father-son relationship. Jefferson, not only out of affection for him, but also out of part of his effort to woo these Federalists and to defuse their hostility and to try to bring them over to his side, had John Quincy Adams to dinner probably more often than anyone else. And there's a good deal in the book about that. Next, please. John Quincy Adams' wife, Louisa Catherine Adams, is the epitome of Federalist snobbery. Some of her letters refer to the pain she suffers coming to the White House and having to have dinner with the buffoonery of the modern democracy. Henry Adams, her grandson, who wrote, of course, the famous Education of Henry Adams, writes about being raised to refer to his grandmother here as the madam. My wife asked me if our grandchildren could be taught to refer to her as the madam. I told her I didn't think that was likely, and so far that's not been a success. Next, please. Just to give you a hint of John Randolph of Roanoke, largely forgotten now, but an incredible figure of his time, a very odd individual. He was about 35 years old when this picture was painted by Gilbert Stuart. Looks about 12 or 14, but an absolute firebrand on Jefferson's side of things in the beginning, flipped over to the other side later on. One of his contemporaries in the House described Randolph as a madman just broken out of his straitjacket. Again, a little hint of the level of political discourse in those days. Once threw a full decanter of wine at a colleague over dinner after a political discussion got a little heated, which one observer said resulted in much destruction of glassware. Next, please. Robert Fulton, the inventor of the steamboat, was a regular visitor to the White House and would sit for hours with Jefferson and go through the mechanics of steam technology and try to decide whether or not a boat might ever be propelled by a steam engine. Next, please. The Baron Friedrich von Humboldt, a Prussian baron who was the great scientist of the day in the world, in fact. Some of you may have heard of the Humboldt Current in South America. He's light years ahead of his time, came to dinner with Jefferson, stayed there for several days, just regaling him with, and he regaling back with every in and out of science and philosophy that there was, geography, exploration. Humboldt, to give you just one sense of his genius, wrote in the year 1800 that he thought that human industrial activity was causing climate change. Next, please. Dolly Madison. Probably if anybody's remembered from Jefferson's circle, it's Dolly Madison, who was the wife of the Secretary of State, James Madison, often served as hostess at Jefferson's dinners, which was necessary. You could not have a woman at a dinner, married, unmarried, with or without an escort, without having a hostess. A man could not host a dinner that women would attend. So Dolly would serve that function for him when she could, since he had no wife. Next, please. James Madison, her husband, a brilliant acolyte of Jefferson's, a small man. Our British friend said that he looked like a country schoolmaster in mourning for one of his pupils who he had just whipped to death. You get a little bit of that seeing this portrait, but actually when the wine was passed and the ladies had left the table, which was the custom at the time, Madison was said to tell stories which are, quote, no longer told in the higher circles of American society. Next, please. Quick look at Sidi Solomon Meli Meli, the ambassador from the Bay of Tunis, at which the United States had been at war, came to Jefferson to negotiate an exchange of captured vessels and such. Again, I just don't have time. I'm just flipping through here, but quite the colorful figure. You can imagine this wilderness capital with all these Yankees and Southerners and Westerners who had never set eyes on anything remotely like Sidi Suleiman Meli Meli. Quite a number of interesting stories there. Next, please. We're getting toward the close here. This is a very interesting portrait, also by Gilbert Stuart, who was kind of the court painter at the time, of a young woman by the name of Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte, who had married the brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, and describes herself in a letter to a friend saying, nature never intended me for obscurity. I think as you look at this portrait, you can see that. She was quite the social belle of the time, showing up at the president's house with Napoleon's brother in a dress in the latest French style, which some of you more astute than I on art history may remember from the paintings of Jacques-Louis David as being, shall we say, daring in the extreme. One Yankee matron described what she wore to the White House as a mere suspicion of a dress. Next slide, please. And you get a sense from this painting by Jacques-Louis David of what she meant. We can only imagine Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte strolling into the White House dressed like that, which she did. And oddly enough, Jefferson seated her at his right, right next to him at the table. Next, please. So now we turn to the last subject, which we'll deal with briefly, which is the promotion of the West. This modern rendering of the Louisiana Purchase, I think, brings home to us in a way we may not have thought about since we were 10 or 12 about the enormity of what this meant. you've got basically a doubling of the size of the United States. Florida was still a French possession. And if you look at, from the northern border of Florida up on the right, and then flip it, you get almost exactly the size of the Louisiana Purchase, which was bought for pennies per acre from Napoleon, who needed money to fight the British. Next, please. Jefferson sent out to examine and explore this vast territory his secretary, his White House secretary, Meriwether Lewis, who is shown in this portrait, the young neighbor of Jefferson's in Virginia, brought him in to Washington as his White House secretary when he was president, and dispatched him with Clark to walk across the uncharted expanse of North America to the Pacific and back. It took them 2.5 years. Nobody knew most of that time if they were alive or dead. Next, please. This is a medal called an Indian Peace Medal that was made in Jefferson's time, designed by him. And it's got him on one side, and on the other side, an Indian hand and an American military officer's hand in uniform, clasping hands with a peace pipe over a tomahawk. And these medals were struck and given out by Lewis and Clark to the Indian chiefs that they met. One of the Federalists said when he was told that Jefferson had designed it, he said, oh, if only he had spent his talents on nothing more important than that. Next, please. This is an actual pastel of one of the Indian chiefs that were brought back by Lewis and Clark, sent back, I should say, before they got back to Washington, to see the city, to meet the president, to begin to establish relationships. And there were two reasons for doing that. One was to try to open up a good start with the Western Indians, and the other was to awe them with what they were seeing, that we can be great friends and we can be terrible enemies, and you don't want to be the latter with us. A lot of interesting stories in the book about the sensation that was made in Washington when dozens of these Western Indians came there. Nobody had seen anything like it, keeping in mind that the Eastern Indians had been assimilated or tragically killed, so that what you were left with in the East was very different than what you saw from the West. Next, please. So Jefferson had the great reception hall at the White House, which is what you walk into when you enter it, made into what he called an Indian hall, and mounted on the walls these trophies and stuffed heads and Indian artifacts from the West, and opened it up as a kind of a museum in Washington, the first one in Washington, to use the White House as a place to display all of this and to get people interested and excited in the West and to think about migrating. Next, please. So this is a contemporary picture of the White House burned out by the British in 1814, 5 years after Jefferson's time. And you can see, if you look at it carefully, looking through the windows, it's gutted out right to the sandstone walls, nothing left in the middle. So we don't have any of the furniture or the design or the artwork or any of the decorative work that Jefferson and Latrobe did. But rather than knocking it down, which they seriously thought about doing, Madison caused it to be completely restored and put back largely the way it was in Jefferson's day. Next, please. So in closing, I have this portrait of Jefferson, another one of his official portraits done in his second term, again with that very simple man of the people, simple background, uncued, unpowdered hair to project himself as what he wanted to be seen as president. And I would like to read you just a 1-minute clip, if you will, from the book in closing that I think sums up a good deal. Thomas Jefferson was a tangled up mix of contradictions, a torrid revolutionary and a temperate head of state, a passionate egalitarian who owned slaves and hated slavery, a champion of the people, wary of the common man, a patrician despised by his own privileged class. 2 centuries after his time, it is fashionable to attack him with modern sensibilities and ample ammunition, but accurately portrayed as a shockingly brilliant, instinctively kind, irresistibly charismatic, sometimes disappointing, unevenly admirable human being who revered his country's principles and subdued his better instincts in complicity with its sins, he was much like our other great presidents, let alone the rest of us who are not shockingly brilliant or irresistible. And with that, I will end 10 minutes past our time, but we did get a late start, and maybe we have some time for questions if there are any.
Okay, if you've got any questions, you can use the chat down below. We do have a question already. Why did Jefferson not run for a third term?
Well, that's an interesting thought. First of all, he had a wonderful first term, very successful in every way. Second term, not so much. Second term was characterized largely by an embargo against Great Britain, which turned into a worldwide embargo against France, Britain, and Spain in an effort to try to stay out of their war, which created a terrible economic catastrophe in the country, and ultimately, of course, did not keep us out of their war. But he was quite politically damaged by that. And secondly, like every president, or almost every president, after 7 or 8 years of that burdensome job, was ready to go home. And in fact, enjoyed a long retirement at Monticello after that.
Another question here. Would Jefferson be conflicted over today's Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, you know, it's always impossible, of course, to know. He would have been astonished by so many things. But I will tell you that his racism was comparable to the racism of every other founding father. You know, we think more about that now than we did when I was growing up, but it's written into the Constitution, and it was just uniform, North and South, those kinds of feelings. But on the other hand, Jefferson was far more progressive on the issue than almost any of his peers in the South, and envisioned scientific proof that this prejudice against Black people was wrong, and expected and hoped to see that kind of study progress, and also expected and hoped that Black people would in fact assimilate and move through the system, and after some generations be freed as slaves and integrate into the system. Actually, very little difference between Jefferson's view of that and Lincoln's view of that at the time Lincoln became president.
The passage you read was quite good, and I was reading some of your book, and you do a good job of talking about the paradox that is Jefferson. For a well-written man of letters, he only gave 2 speeches, his first and second inaugural address. For someone who was devastated by the loss of his wife, and you know, his daughters were doting on him, and yet he also took some interest in some younger, almost in a fatherly way, Meriwether Lewis, John Quincy Adams. I found that fascinating that John Adams and Abigail referred to Thomas Jefferson, and kind of collectively, this is as our John. That like he was part Jefferson, and I thought that was interesting how he talked about that. So can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, they were very close during the Revolution, and respected each other's intelligence. You know, Adams was always more conservative than Jefferson, but not in any radical way. But the great split of the parties that took place in the 1790s kind of put a damper on all of that. Mrs. Adams had in fact been, if anything, closer to Jefferson than John had. and described him in a letter as one of the choice ones of the earth. I'll tell you what, everybody who encounters Jefferson, with very few exceptions, whether they despised him politically or idolized him politically, everybody liked him. If you spent an hour with Jefferson, you could not help but walk out of there thinking him a good guy that you wanted to spend time with, and a man of tremendous depth and character and charm, of the sort that we'd like to see our country produce a little more often.
You also mentioned that Jefferson's vision of the presidential house, I think was the original name, the president's house,
Yeah.
was to be kind of this palace in the woods. Now, Pierre L'Enfant designs the city, and he ultimately wins out. But you can see from those early pictures, he really did want to have that palace in the woods. Isn't that kind of his vision?
Well, two things. One is the reason Washington was set up at all was a compromise between Jefferson and Hamilton. There's a famous dinner in Jefferson's home with Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton, and they're trying to solve a dilemma. The Federalists wanted the federal government to assume the debts of the states from the Revolution, and thereby have the economic power, a national bank, start to concentrate economic power in the federal government. The Republicans didn't want that, but they did want the capital to be in the South. So they made this compromise and put Washington where it is, and then agreed that it would be built out and then occupied in 10 years. So there's that. But the other part of I'm sorry, I lost the train of the other part of your question.
Well, his original vision for the White House, or the President Palace, was to be a palace in the woods.
Right. Well, actually, I should say that he would prefer that it not be a palace, that it actually be a much more modest, sort of a gentleman's home. He had actually entered the contest to design the White House himself back in the 1790s, and had submitted a drawing for a very nice, substantial house, but much simpler, smaller, less imposing than what was actually chosen. And his vision of Washington was that would be a small town with very nice but very simple American brick public buildings, some parks, and a very small town growing up around it. L'Enfant's plan won out over that, much grander, based on Parisian boulevards and all of that, because Washington was president and Jefferson was not, and Washington wanted that kind of thing.
Okay. Another question, please remind me, why did the British torch the White House?
Well, it was in the middle of the War of 1812, and they had an expeditionary force that was sent over here not to conquer the country, it was too small to do that, but to harass and intimidate and cause havoc. And one of those missions included a trip up the Potomac River with this very substantial British force that kind of brushed aside the American militia, and as a statement of power, burned both the Capitol and the White House, and then moved on.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I want to thank Mr. Conroy. The name of his book is Jefferson's White House, Monticello on the Potomac. Good luck with this. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Stay safe, everyone. Our next talk will be Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock. So we hope you join us for that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Conroy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.